Alrighty, we'll get started. So next up is HTML and CSS Talk by Tika. So whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone, so my name is Tika. I'm a freshman studying computer science, and I'll be leading the HTML and CSS talk. So just before we get started, put into chat like if you ever heard of HTML and CSS or like how familiar you are with them. So, and while we wait for you guys to do that, I'll just go over the rules for questions real quick. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat and someone will get to you. And at certain points in the talk, I'm going to pause and ask for questions. And at that point, you can just unmute yourself and say what you want to say. All right, so I think we can get started. So basically, HTML and CSS together form the backbone of the internet. And so together, they let you create static yet pretty web pages. HTML is all about formatting and creating content in a way that a computer can display on a browser. And CSS is all about adding stylistic features to that HTML content in a way that can make really pretty web pages. So to get more into what HTML is, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And you might notice that it's a markup language, not a programming language. So the difference is because programming languages have things like logic and loops where a computer can perform computations and do things. But HTML, as a markup language, only lets you format content in a way that a browser can share, as I mentioned earlier. This is really important because it lets your content be displayed in a way that can be accessed by people all over the world. So HTML is used basically everywhere. The whole internet, all web pages, or most web pages at least, are running on HTML. And web development is kind of the most useful format for HTML. But you can also use it for digital publishing. So sometimes ebooks are actually written in HTML. But the main takeaway is that HTML is the backbone of the internet. So getting more into the basics of how to actually use HTML, HTML is created out of these things called elements. And elements are made out of three main parts. The first part is a tag. So it's just some type of, I guess, marker that tells you what this element is, and it's set inside of pointy brackets. Then after that comes the content. So the content is the actual information you're putting within the element itself. And finally, you have an end tag, which is similar to the start tag, but has a slash in it. And that just lets the computer know when that element is over. There's a few things to note. So some elements have start and end tags, and most actually do, but there are some that only have start tags. So a really, I guess, prevalent example would be image. So ing only has a start tag, and it doesn't make sense for an image to end. There's only one continuous image. So it's just important to know which ones are start and end and which ones are only start. Also, HTML is really, really versatile, and you can use whatever you want and include as many or as few tags and elements as you would like, but there are a few that are mandatory to have. So the main ones are doc type, which just lets your computer know that everything after this is going to be in HTML. Then is the HTML tag, which just lets your computer know where the HTML begins and ends. And then you have head and body. So head is all about what goes in your tab section and also where you can link in your style sheet and any other important information that's related to the metadata aspect of it. And then the body is where you put all your tags and elements and content that you're going to display on the actual web page itself. So we just got through some pretty important information. So if there's any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them right now. Or just keep putting them in the chat. And with that, we'll continue. So the structure of HTML is pretty intuitive. A really good way to think about it is through the idea of nested bullet points. So with a nested bullet point system, you have items on the left that are higher in hierarchy than items on the right that are underneath it. And so in this sense, you can see what contains other information. So HTML is just like that. You'll have within, say, your body, you can have different paragraphs or lists or divs or just tables, whatever you want, you can put underneath that. And those can also have their own elements inside of them. So this way, the computer can see what's structured how, and it lets content be organized in a way that's really easy for humans to understand and for computers to understand and display. We're going to go through a quick quiz on what is parent and what is child for certain elements and tags. So as you can see on the left, you can see a quick structure of HTML, and just quickly in the chat, put what you think the parent element is for the list item. And we'll give you about 30 seconds for that. So I hope there's lots of bodies there, because that is the correct answer. And let's see, a harder one will be, what are the children elements of the div tag in this example? And we'll give another 30 seconds for that too. So whoever said none, that's correct. The div doesn't have any children element because there's nothing underneath and to the right of the div tag. So now we're going to get into the idea of attributes. So attributes are just ways to add more information to your tag, and they're often in the start tag. So the way you can create an attribute is, or the way you, I guess, implement attributes is by putting the name of the attribute and setting it equal to some value. So for example, if you had an image that was like 1,000 by 1,000 pixels and you wanted to shrink it, you would just give it new attributes of height and width, which you can set to say 500 by 500. That way you can adapt your HTML content to fit whatever usage you want it to. Some really important attributes are href, which is how you link things, which you can put into like the A tag. And you also have source, which is how you link images into the image tag. Another really important attribute is the idea of class. And class is just how you group together different types of content that you think should be together. So this whole idea of class is why HTML integrates really nicely with CSS and with JavaScript. So an example of how you would use class is, say for example, you had a big list of all the countries that you know, and say you wanted to highlight or do something special with the countries that you visited. So you could give the countries that you visited some class called like visited already or something like that, and you can manipulate all those countries together because they all have the same class. So this is why HTML is really scalable and why it's so easy to do a lot of things at a more efficient pace with HTML. So now that we've gone over HTML, we have to talk about how to make our ugly HTML pages look a lot better. But before we do that, are there any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask them right now. All right, we'll get going then. So here's an example of Amazon, and on the left side, you can see what Amazon looks like for most people. It looks really nice. There's lots of images and different size headers and things like that. And on the right side, you can see the same thing, but without all the additional CSS that makes it look really nice and like pretty. So clearly you can tell that CSS is really, really important for the user's end. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and we'll get to the cascading part soon. It's really good to have CSS because it lets you have customizable features and lets you like build a very unified web page. And the good thing is there's a lot of pre-existing sources because people have been using and developing with CSS for a long time. So it's really easy to get high quality and really aesthetically pleasing sources out there. So in addition to just being how you add style, CSS is really important for this concept called responsiveness. So responsiveness is all about how your web page adapts and how it manages different screen sizes. So have you ever been on a website on your PC and everything looks normal, things are formatted correctly, and it looks really nice, but on the same website on your phone, words are missing, text is cut off, sometimes images don't load correctly. That's an example of poor responsiveness. Understanding responsiveness really helps you make sure that your web page is accessible to people on different devices, and it helps overall just making sure that your content is formatted properly. So responsiveness is a pretty complex topic, and it's really hard to understand sometimes. So if there are any questions on this or anything we just went over, feel free to unmute yourself right now and you can ask. All right, I guess we'll get going. So here's just a quick example of a good responsive website. So as you can tell, things are formatted based off the screen size. And on the right side, you can see that the text and stuff aren't properly formatted because it was hard-coded in there and people didn't take the time to do their CSS properly. So after this talk, you guys are all going to be experts and make really good websites that are responsive. So now we're going to get into the basics of CSS. So there are three main parts to writing any code in CSS. The first is a selector. So a selector is the element or class that you are trying to change or impact. Then you have properties, which are the actual features of that selector that you're trying to change. And then finally, you have values, which is what you're setting the properties to be. And we will see an example of this in the next slide. So here's what CSS actually looks like. On the left, you see like a generic structure of selectors and properties and values. And on the right is an actual example of someone making a header look nice. So just to go over a few key features, the selector can be either an element. So you can say like H1, which is a header size, which you're trying to impact. Or you can say like a paragraph, so P. Or you can do selectors based off of class. So, but just to make sure when you're doing classes, use dot notation, which is when you just put a period in front of the class name, just to make sure that the computer knows that you're accessing the class and not some element that it doesn't recognize. Then the properties depend on what type of selector you're using. So for example, if you have paragraph, it can have properties of like color and things like that, but paragraph won't have border collapse, which a table does because there's no border to collapse. And also, different properties have different numbers of values that you can add. So for color, there are so many different types of colors just by name or by RGB values or just like the hex codes. So there's almost an infinite number of ways to add color. But with things like text align, there's only so many ways that you can really align text. So there's only so many ways that you can, so many values to add for that property. And then another really important concept when it comes to CSS is the idea of inheritance. So inheritance is all about how properties transfer from parents to their children. So most of the time, properties are inherited. So if you give like a body section the property of being like blue for the text, then all the paragraphs underneath will be blue and all the divs and things like that will have blue text in them as well. But sometimes you can run into issues with like, say if you make a body blue, but then you give the text specifically in like the paragraph underneath the property being green, you can run into issues with like what is being controlled and what is being inherited. So CSS has some really cool ways of managing that. So to control the flow of inheritance, you can use these values. Note that they're values, not properties. These values of inherit, initial, unset, and reset. And so these four values let you kind of manage how the different CSS properties are being controlled and lets you decide like what goes where basically. So this is a pretty difficult concept, but if you think about it in the same way that the nested bullet points were described, then it's pretty easy to understand. And it's definitely intuitive. So if there are any questions on inheritance, because it's a pretty complicated topic, then just ask them right now or on anything we've gone through so far. Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. All right, looks like there's no questions, so we'll move on. So now that you've figured out how to, I guess, write CSS, adding CSS is a whole nother story, but there are three main ways to do that. So first is to externally add in CSS. So this is achieved through linking in a style sheet. So in your head section of your HTML page, you would just add a link to whatever your style sheet is. And this way you can keep all your HTML code in one place and your CSS code in another place. And that just makes sure everything is kept clean and separate, and it lets people work on things at like different times and not get in each other's way. The next way is through internally adding in your CSS, which means just adding in a style section into your head and just writing your CSS code there. This is really, I guess, an easy and fast method of doing it, but it gets really complicated if you have a lot of CSS, then all your HTML code gets pushed down to the bottom. And the final way of adding in CSS is through inline styling, which is when you just add a style section to the actual line that you're trying to change. So you add the attribute style and just write whatever you want in there. The good thing about this is it's really easy, really fast, and super low effort, but you also lose some of that ability to be customizable and change things really quickly, because if you want to change it, you have to go to each individual element that you added the style to and change things, which takes a lot longer and it's a lot less efficient. So all three of these methods have their own merits and their own detriments. It's just how you want to add it and what purpose you're using it for that you choose what format of CSS you want to add. And finally, we're going to talk about Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is an open source framework for HTML and CSS, and that just is fancy words for saying that anyone can use it and anyone can contribute to it, and it's just a big resource for all your HTML and CSS needs. The good thing about Bootstrap is they offer a lot of really, really cool features, such as like drop-down menus and collapsibles and navigation bars, and it's already pre-written for you. And it looks really pretty, so a lot of Bootstrap content is aesthetically pleasing and will fit whatever aesthetic you want. And it's all written like by professionals, so it looks really nice and it works really nice, and that's really important. So Bootstrap is a great resource to learn about CSS and to find actual pre-written, I guess, concepts and content. So here are some resources. So we've listed all, we've linked all the types of tags and attributes and CSS properties, because it's really hard, I guess, to find what you don't know exists. So feel free to use these links to learn more about HTML and CSS, or to go deeper into what's out there in terms of properties and tags. And yeah, so now we're going to move on to the lab. So today's lab is going to be making a personal website. So personal websites are increasingly more popular, and it's a great way to show off your HTML and CSS skills and to show off your resume, your job experience, and your education history. We've listed, so in the lab, we've linked a lot of possible suggestions for what you should be adding or what we suggest you should add. And we also have different ways to implement them. So we've linked some Bootstrap resources to adding those elements. But remember that this is a personal website, so whatever you guys want to add, feel free to do that. And that's the beauty of HTML and CSS, because you can customize it to whatever your tastes are and whatever your needs are. And yeah, if there are any final questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them on either the lab or the slides themselves. And if not, then that's the talk. I hope you guys learned a lot about HTML and CSS and how to implement them, and I hope you guys are ready to do a great job on the lab.
Thank you, Tika.